We're joined in conversation by Pulitzer Prize-winning American journalist Christopher Hedges and Dr. Taiaiake Alfred, who directs the Indigenous Governance Program at the University of Victoria. What accounts for what they're calling the apparent nuttiness of gun culture, both here and in the United States?
The gun culture in the United States is really born in the 19th century. The gun culture as we know it didn't really exist at the time of the Revolution because everybody kind of had guns and there wasn't a need to fetishize guns. It happens in the 19th century as the United States starts to urbanize and it closes its frontier. Closing its frontier is a euphemism for having shuffled all the Indians off to reservations and all that stuff. So the gun culture is born as the United States is exterminating its indigenous peoples. And you can't get away from that. And it all grows from there.
Racism is the engine that drives America. And because basically you have, especially aging white males who've been pushed out of the workplace, they're fallen into a kind of despair. Reminds me, by the way, of the breakdown of the former Yugoslavia. And they watch the rise of groups that are not white. I mean, we are headed to become a nation that I don't know when, how many more decades, that will not be majoritarian white. And that strikes fear in these people. So and the rise of groups like militias, like the Tea Party, the Christian right, which fetishizes guns, all of these groups go back to this fear that white supremacy is under assault.
And not only not white, but the rise of groups that are not male. That's the other half of it.
Yeah, I think that's right.
It's beleaguered masculinity is a big part of this culture.
It's pathetic masculinity.
Agreed.
Which would certainly explain probably one of the most famous Canadian incidents involved in this kind of nutty gun culture, and that would be the Montreal Massacre.
Right. And I would say, I do have the chapter that deals with mass shootings, and I kind of resisted having a chapter on mass shootings for a while because the mass shooter, I view him not as a part of the gun culture so much as a consequence of the gun culture. But what happens with these guys is your mass shooter is typically a kind of narcissistic loser with delusions of grandeur, and he has to latch on to some ideology that's already out there in the air. And in the case of the Montreal Massacre, it was the anti-feminist backlash that he's latched onto. And we see this again and again. Anders Breivik in Norway latches on to the anti-Muslim thing going on in Europe. So they're always grabbing onto these things.
Chris, does the example of Blair Mountain in West Virginia, Andrew talks about it in the book and we talked about it earlier in the conversation, does that hold any insights for you? Does race ever enter into the question?
Blair Mountain, along with the Shea Rebellion at the end of the Revolutionary War, were attempts to challenge encroaching power in the case of Blair Mountain by the unions, in the case of the Shea Rebellion by the federal government. But they are rarities within American culture. We have, of course, 40% of American households own weapons. We have, they're pervasive throughout the country. But it's coupled with this kind of odd fact that Americans don't have a tradition of turning their weapons against the government. And of course, most of these uprisings, take Blair Mountain, were about specific local injustices, not challenging the system of white supremacy and capitalism. Although it's interesting that the miners were racially and ethnically mixed. And when they rose up, as Andrew said, when the federal government was called in to crush it, they buried their weapons and went home. One of the little-known facts about Blair Mountain is that the miners were using new Winchester rifles, and it's largely assumed that the United Mine Workers had shipped down crates of those weapons. It's something the United Mine Workers would never say in their official history. But that was really, these people, and I think Andrew got that in the book, and I spent a lot of time in southern West Virginia for my own book, Days of Destruction, Days of Revolt, and write about this incident as well. They were really pushed to the breaking point. Remember, this wasn't just Sid Hatfield, but miners were being murdered, evicted from their homes, and they were pushed to the breaking point. They didn't. After that uprising, the unions did not gain legitimacy until Roosevelt in the late 30s permitted their existence. So in the immediate aftermath of that uprising, the mine owners won.